sources of information, the role where the information is needed, and the decisions where the information is needed. Essentially, it turns that table on its head, but this basically summarizes it in a much more compact fashion. You can go through those at your leisure. Public emergency responder, same issue. But you see some of the information there. You know, obviously product identification, the first one. Is there physical damage? Do we have appropriate resources in terms of protective equipment, depending on the product involved? And then what are life safety implications of entry or non-entry, et cetera. And again, there's a full list of these in the report that you have. So why should pipeline operators and government agencies collaborate in developing their own analyses? Well, I think we found, and I think it's safe to say from this study, that you get a much richer and higher quality understanding of the results of the analysis when it's done together. Also, through participating in the process, you have ownership of the results. This allows you to tailor the findings to the peculiarities of the jurisdiction. That's particularly important for the information flow, right? Do we have interoperable radios with law enforcement? Do we have the same dispatch center? Can we talk to the pipeline operator? Are we talking to them on radio? Are they on our channel? Are we talking to them by phone? Are we talking to the control center? Are we talking to the field supervisor? All those things need to be worked out. The benefits of using this is that, it's an important one that I didn't mention before, is it gets the right information to the right people at the right time. And it's very important in avoiding cognitive overload, which basically says, you know, people get inundated, right? And the great example of that is it's very role specific, right? I don't need to know everything if I'm fulfilling the role of fire service responder, right? I'd gone to White Plains, we're a combined police-fire agency. I got paged out for a fire in a downtown, commercial building in the middle of the night, and I'm responding in. It was fairly early in my tenure, and I call the dispatch and I say, what resources do we have at the fire? And the dispatcher starts telling me, well, we have car 11 and we have car 16 and Main Street's blocked and blah, blah, blah. And I said, less artfully, I don't really care how many police cars we have blocking traffic. I'd like to know how many fire trucks we've got on the incident, and do we have any left? And do we need to start calling people in, right? So it's role-based, right? And so you need to focus it down to get the right information. I don't need to know at that time. As a deputy commissioner the next day, yeah, that's great. But there's a police supervisor on duty who can manage that part of it. I needed to be concerned with that information. I needed to get it. Likewise, if you have a pipeline operator, they need to know, what signs do you have of a release? Is there anybody injured? Can you give an estimate of the amount of release or how quickly it's coming out? And most importantly, where is it, right? That's what they need to know, and they need to know that now. They don't necessarily need to know all the other things that go along with that. So to conclude, and the conclusion goes on for a little bit, just to warn you. The priority needs, you have to obviously identify the product involved. You need to know those communication needs before an incident, right? I'm just repeating some of this now, but it bears repeating. We have to incorporate pipeline. Now, this is for the emergency managers, right? This was a group that we brought in as part of our research. We said, hey, look, this is a classic emergency management problem, right? This isn't an everyday incident, and these are complex incidents that can very quickly turn into large-scale, long-duration campaign-type incidents. You need to bring pipelines into your community emergency planning process, right? And throw a pipeline in with your training and exercises, right? So, we're always doing earthquakes and floods and wildfires. Let's throw in a pipeline. And detection of incidents relies mainly on human census from the public. Pipeline operators are often secondary. This was a study that was done by PIMSA in the US. Again, for large incidents, I don't want to squabble about it, but public is indeed, public emergency responders do indeed detect many pipeline emergencies before the pipeline operator, okay? And that's generalizing across the different types of pipelines and the different types of products and the whole sophistication of SCADA systems that are out there, bearing in mind some are very old, some are newer. The communications is indeed a critical need. The role of communications, particularly 911 centers, was not adequately recognized in the literature. And so if you looked at all the pipeline materials that had been developed prior to this, they were geared at, okay, starting from the assumption that, okay, you have a pipeline emergency. Now what do you do? And so it's like, here's how you control oil, here's how you put out the fire, here's how you do this, here's how you do that. And none of it was really looking at this initial stage of trying to recognize that you have that incident and trying to notify the right people at the right time. Existing guidance documents are largely silent on the tactical communication issues. Existing U.S. regulation encourages communication, but does not specify the content, the frequency, or the parties involved. Pipeline operators need to know in the U.S. the 10-digit direct dial number for each communication center along the pipeline route. And there's NENA, the National Emergency Number Association, in the States has a database where they can, pipeline operators subscribe to that and then give them any GPS coordinates. They can tell you the right center to call that's going to get any town volunteer fire company notified. Another issue that came out predominantly among dispatch personnel is this notion of confirmation bias. That's going back to San Bruno, where I think it's an airplane crash, and so every piece of information I have is going to support the theory that it's an airplane crash, right? So, gee, I heard a whistle. Well, was it a whistle from a natural gas coming out of the pipeline? No, it was a jet engine, because it was a plane crash, right? And we see that, and this is a tough one because we get a lot of natural gas calls in the fire service coming to the 911 center, all right? And just like that one in Santa Barbara, how do you know the big ones from the small ones? And we have to work with our pipeline operators to identify the presence and characteristics of pipelines in or near your service area. Okay, you have to do that, and that's a regulatory requirement. A series of critical challenges. I'm not going to go through all this, but the National Energy Board pointed me to this. Sections 33 to 35 of onshore pipeline regulations basically require that the pipeline operator is responsible for reaching out to their local emergency services, making them aware of infrastructure they have in their area of responsibility, and providing continuing education. Again, you've got to train your PSAP personnel. They're critical. They don't get included. Many times you'll do exercises and you don't include that the 911 system component. They must be there. There's a NENA, National Emergency Number Association in the States. It's 911 systems, standard 56-007. It's a free document. They have a model procedure for interrogating callers for potential pipeline incidents. Ideally, whether you have CAD systems, why couldn't you take pipeline locations and set up a buffer and anything within 100 yards of a pipeline, have that come up with a dispatcher, right? So Mrs. Jones smells gas in her yard. Well, if Mrs. Jones is, someplace where they don't even have natural gas service, that's one thing. If Mrs. Jones is, adjacent to a transmission line, well, maybe that's something you ought to be aware of, especially if you get 2 or 3 or 4 calls at 3 in the morning talking about an odor of gas or an odor of oil, something like that. Plan and exercise. We talked about develop plans for pre and early incident communication, develop scripts that include key information needed by the key responders. These are things you would work out on the local basis with your pipeline operators, with allied utilities. Don't forget your water and electric operators where they've got infrastructure that is near the pipeline. Other first responder groups and environmental responders. You can't leave them out. They're going to be crucial to your success if you have an incident. You need to exercise the communications. Practice it, right? Don't just put it in a binder and put it on the shelf and then, 6 years later, take it off after the incident and say, oh, yeah, that's right. That's what we were supposed to do. Exercise the call taking, right? And include emergency management. And then plan, exercise, repeat. That's FEMA US Doctrine, but it's allied with, consistent with what you're doing here in Canada. And then for more information, there's some links there, and I'm sure we can pass those along. But there's an app actually called Pipeline Emergencies in the states, the National Association of State Fire Marshals. It's a response app, but it's very useful. I think the information maps well. There's a website, Pipeline 101. The Canadian Common Ground Alliance, which is your group that keeps track of the infrastructure for excavators, and they now have a web-based utility for entering that system, and the Canada Energy Pipeline Association, which is the trade association of pipeline operators, predominantly transmission line operators. And then there's a series of National Energy Board resources that are there, and I guess we can pass those links on as well. And so just want to acknowledge the participants in the Transportation Research Board panel who oversaw the project, but more importantly, approximately 30 reviewers who represented industry, emergency responders, all the major trade associations and environmental officials, and approximately another 25 personnel who participated in workshops that were held in Houston, Texas, and Mahwah, New Jersey. So with that, we are ready for questions. And I think there's going to be a microphone in the audience. You won't be shown on camera if you're asking a question, but Julie will move that around, and I'll do my best to answer any questions. There's one.
In the early stages of the construction...
Actually, I think wait for the mic because they're recording this.
Yeah, they're recording.
In the early stages of the construction for the gas lines, have you seen a certain time period where incidents would start to happen? Like obviously a couple of them were in the 50s. That's a long time to break down that pipe. You know, everybody's saying now, you know, okay, it's going to last for so many years before we have an incident. Have you seen anything in any of your reports that is a concern for first responders of new construction?
I couldn't really characterize that. I can just say that, and I'm not a metallurgist, and you get into very deep technical detail on the metallurgy of pipelines, corrosion, and all those issues. It's not as simple as old pipelines are less safe than new pipelines. And so I probably should leave it at that. With a group this large, I'll probably just dig myself into a hole. So yes. So no, the short answer is no, you can't. How's that?
Thanks very much for your presentation. Just a quick question. Given that many people would not understand that it's a pipeline emergency, was there consideration done around this, with this panel, around public education?
The public education, now you mean educating the general public, not emergency responders? That is a component of in the states, what they call the integrity management programs for pipeline operators. That was outside of the boundaries of what we were looking at for this effort. But clearly the case of San Bruno and several other incidents indicate that probably more could be done to get that information to people. But it's a very difficult challenge, right? Because you have, we get into this, I was at an emergency management conference and people were bemoaning, that, gee, they don't have a go kit. We can't get people to make a go kit. And it's like, well, people got other things to do, right? They got to worry about things here and now, and it's difficult to stimulate action on those longer term issues. But I think more could be done, and certainly that would be, I think, a good add-on once the emergency response piece was good in a community to then help and be complementary with that, because you're going to get better information from the public if they're aware of infrastructure in the area, and so all of a sudden they're out and they start smelling an odd smell. It's not just going to be a crazy odd smell call. It's maybe they'll say, I think there was something here, and maybe they'll trigger something in the dispatcher that would get a response sooner. An example that I don't know why, I guess I must have taken that out, but in Marshall, Michigan, there was a very large oil spill, and it was a oil pipeline. There was a spill,